was his seal of certainty. It was him really giving us his authoritative word that what he said was going to come to pass. But in making this statement, he stated something that is of equal importance. He said, "Heaven and earth will pass away." Jesus is revealing to us here that in contrast to the word of God, which will endure forever, this creation, as we now know it, will not. Heaven and earth will one day pass away. And it is at this point that the Lord pivots from the lesser judgment to the greater judgment. He pivots away from the local judgment of Jerusalem to the global judgment of the world. He is going to move from the passing away of Jerusalem and of all of the Jewish state which it represented to the passing away of heaven and earth. Notice what he says in verse 36. After he has made this statement in verse 35 that heaven and earth will pass away, in verse 36 he says, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only." And this is our second hint that Jesus is making a transition here. Because first he said that heaven and earth are going to pass away, which kind of cues us in that he's going to move into discussing the end of all things, the end of the world as we know it. But he also uses a phrase here that is very important. He says, "but concerning." That's the Greek phrase, "peri-di," which we see used as a marker of a transition. And Paul uses this same phrase all throughout his first letter to the Corinthians. And every time that he uses this phrase, it indicates that he's moving to a new subject. Notice in 1 Corinthians 7:1, he says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote." That's the same Greek phrase there, and he's introducing a new topic. Again, in chapter 7, verse 25, he says, "Now concerning the betrothed, now concerning food offered to idols, now concerning spiritual gifts," and on and on. Each time Paul is using this phrase, he is indicating that he's changing gears, that he's moving into a new subject, that he's transitioning into a new topic. And I believe that the Lord is using the phrase in the same way. He is transitioning from the judgment of Jerusalem to the judgment of the world. And that is what we are going to be considering over the next hours, the judgment of the world. But there's another thing I want you to notice in this statement that he makes in verse 36. He says that concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Now, this is another obvious shift from what he was saying before, because in the previous section, when he was describing the destruction of Jerusalem, he was giving very explicit signs. He was giving them very clear indications of when it would occur. Notice what he said in verse 33. He said, "So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates." Jesus was giving them explicit indication of when the judgment of Jerusalem was approaching. And we looked at that in that section where he talked about the abomination of desolation and the Roman armies approaching the city of Jerusalem. But so this is what he said about that judgment. He said that when you see these things, you know. But now he's saying concerning that day and hour, no one knows. He's denying that even he knows at that point. The Son knew when these things would occur, but the Father only, he says. And so this is the most obvious indication that he is making a shift here. In the previous section, he was insisting that they could know, and in this section, he insists that they cannot know. And that is it's upon that fact, the unexpected nature of the final judgment, that the rest of this discourse is founded. The rest of Matthew chapter 25, or rather 24, and then Matthew chapter 25, is founded upon the fact that we cannot know when he will return. There's going to be no signs. There's not going to be anything that precedes the final judgment that will let us know that it is coming. It is going to happen in an instant, and we are going to be unaware of it until the moment it occurs. And so the lesson from this section that Jesus insists upon, the great theme of this second section of this discourse, we find in verse 44. He says, "Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." That is the overall theme of this section. The Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Therefore, you must be ready at all times. That is the great thrust of this section, is be ready no matter what. You cannot anticipate it. You cannot know when it will occur. And so the only way to respond is to be ready no matter when it occurs. And so the central theme of this section is readiness in the midst of uncertainty. Readiness in the midst of uncertainty. We are uncertain of when the final judgment will occur, and so we must be ready for it no matter when it does happen. And so let's begin with this first section of this new section in this discourse, starting in verse 36. Again, we're going to reread that. We're going to read down through verse 44 of Matthew 24. He says, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." And so in this section, Jesus is clearly emphasizing the unexpected nature of the final judgment. And he begins by comparing it to a historic precedent. He compares it to the flood in the days of Noah. He likens the final judgment to the judgment upon the ancient world back in the book of Genesis. He says that for as they were in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And I want you to notice the distinction that he makes between the nature of the first century and that generation and how turbulent that time was going to be versus how he describes Noah's generation. He says that in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So when he was talking about the judgment of Jerusalem, he was talking about wars and famines. He was talking about earthquakes. And now he's talking about a generation in which people were going about normal, everyday activities. There was not these great heavenly signs. There were not these very clear indications of the judgment that awaited them. People were simply eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. And this is what he likens the final judgment to. He is insisting that just as in Noah's day, people are going to be going about everyday activities. There's not going to be any sort of heads up that the final judgment is coming. He says, as it was then, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And so then he insists that during this event, there's going to be an act of separation. He says in verses 40 through 41 that there will be 2 men in the field. One will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one left. And I don't think that we need to press this too far. I think that what Jesus is talking about here is, again, the same thing that he was saying when he was referencing Noah's generation. He's saying that people are going to be going about normal, everyday activities whenever he returns. People are going to be in the field. They're going to be grinding at the mill, doing their normal, everyday activities. And then this separation is going to occur. We can compare this to what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 16 through 17. He said that the Lord himself will descend from heaven with the cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. I believe this is what is being conveyed in verses 40 through 41 of Matthew 24, that there's going to be this separation, that those who belong to Christ, the elect, are going to be caught up into the air with him, and it's going to happen in an instant. Then he says that in verse 42, immediately after he has stated this, that people are going to be separated in this way, he says, therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. And I want you to just notice how many times he emphasizes this fact. You don't know, so stay awake. Be ready, be prepared for whenever it occurs. And then he describes a thief breaking into a house, and then he finishes by saying again that you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. And so he's laid down the central theme of this section. When it comes to the final judgment, we will not be able to anticipate it. There will not be signs of the times. There will not be any sort of heavenly markers of when it will occur. He says you must be ready, for it will happen when you do not expect. And in the remaining section of this discourse, starting in verses 45 all the way through verse 46 of Matthew 25, he's going to continue to elaborate on this fact using illustrations and applications. He's going to give us 4 different illustrations throughout the remainder of this discourse, which are going to underscore this fact that he states in verse 44, that we must be ready for the unexpected final judgment. And so let us begin by looking at these applications, starting with the first one in verses 45 through 51. In verses 45 through 51, we have the parable of the household. And this is not, it's not explicitly referred to as a parable, and it's somewhat distinct from the parable of the 10 virgins and the parable of the talents that follow. But what Jesus is using here is figurative language. He's giving us what is, in essence, a parable to underscore the need for readiness. In all of these sections, the next 4 sections, Jesus is showing us readiness versus negligence. He's showing us the difference between those who are ready for the final judgment and those who are not ready for it. And I want you to notice with each of these that is going to be, that's the central distinction or contrast that's being made. He's going to bring out different details. He uses different characters, and he draws out different nuances of the final judgment in each of these sections. But ultimately, with all 4 of these illustrations, he is drawing a contrast between readiness and negligence. He's showing us what readiness looks like and how he will deal with those who are negligent, those who are not ready. So let's begin with the parable of the household, starting in verse 45. He says, "Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly, I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, 'My master is delayed,' and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And so here we have our first contrast, the first of the 4 contrasts in this final section, in which the Lord is drawing a distinction between a faithful servant and a faithless servant. He's describing one servant who is actively engaged in his stewardship and another servant who is taking advantage of his master's absence. The determining factor, what separates these 2 servants, what distinguishes them, is what they are doing whenever their master arrives. That's what really is the final distinction between them. The first servant, the faithful and wise servant, is found engaged in his stewardship without any regard to his master's delay. He's really not worried over when his master will come, because no matter when his master comes, he's going to be doing what he's supposed to do. And indeed, Jesus says that this servant who is found in this state, this favorable condition, is going to be rewarded as a result. But then the wicked servant, he says to himself, in the LSB version, it says, "My master is not coming for a long time." He's anticipating that he has more time than he actually has. He's looking at his master's delay as an indication that he can kind of do whatever he wants in the interim. He can go and beat on his fellow servants. He can eat and drink with the drunkards, and maybe he'll get his life together. He'll get everything in order before his master arrives. But Jesus insists that you cannot possibly anticipate his coming in this way. He says in verse 50, "The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know." There will be many who are caught red-handed whenever the Lord returns, who are are not expecting his arrival, who think that maybe they have more time than they actually have. And like this wicked servant, they will be punished as a result. But the point, again, is the unexpected nature of this judgment. He says the master will come on a day when he does not expect him, in an hour he does not know. And so in this first illustration, we're seeing this contrast between faithfulness and faithlessness. We're seeing how one should ready themselves for the Lord's return. And we do so by being actively engaged in our service to Christ, no matter when he arrives. That we're not trying to guess or anticipate him and do whatever we want during the interim and try to clean up our lives right before he arrives. We are constantly going about our stewardship in the manner in which we should. This brings us to the second contrast in the second parable, and that is the parable of the 10 virgins. We're going to look at this section next, and although there's going to be some different details here, I want you to notice that the message is ultimately the same. He's going to change the characters a bit. The master in the previous section is going to become the bridegroom, and the servants of the previous section are going to become virgins. But ultimately, the main point he is making is very much the same. So let us begin in verse 1 of chapter 25. Jesus says, "Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, 'Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him.' Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' But the wise answered, saying, 'Since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves.' And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterward, the other virgins came also, saying, 'Lord, Lord, open to us.' But he answered, 'Truly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour.'" So once again, we have a period of absence, a unexpected or lengthy delay followed by a sudden arrival. The virgins were expecting the bridegroom to arrive, but they were not anticipating his delay. And once he delays, there were half of them who were prepared for the delay, and there was half of them who were not prepared for that delay. And those who were prepared were welcomed into the wedding feast, whereas those who were not prepared were excluded. The door was shut, and they were not allowed inside. And what I want you to notice here is that, again, the central lesson is the same, that we need to be prepared, we need to be ready. But here the contrast he's drawing is a little bit different than the first illustration, because in the first illustration, he was giving us a contrast between a faithful servant and a wicked servant. He was showing us one who was faithful to his station and one who was unfaithful to it. But here the distinction is not so much between faithfulness and faithlessness. It is between wisdom and foolishness. The word that he uses to describe these 5 virgins, the foolish virgins, is a Greek word moranos, which we get the English word moron from. And so he's essentially saying that these women, these 5 virgins, were foolish because they were not prepared. It was not simply a matter of faithlessness, it was a matter of foolishness. They should have anticipated this potential delay and have prepared themselves for it. But although the details have changed, as I said, the ultimate lesson has not. He says in verse 13, "Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." And so that is the second of the 4 contrasts that he makes in this section. And that brings us to the third, and that is the parable of the talents. And again, we're going to see a similar message with just slightly different details, but this one is going to have many resemblances to the first illustration because, again, we have a master and his servants. We have a delay, a period of absence that is then followed by a reckoning. So let us begin reading in verse 14 all the way down to verse 30. It says, "For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing the 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and I hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he thinks, or even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This, I think, is one of the most striking illustrations that he has given yet. And I want you to notice that while there are many similarities between this illustration and the first one, as we said, this is a master and his servants. There is a period of absence followed by a reckoning. What I want you to notice is the distinction here is a little bit different. Again, we have faithful servants who have handled themselves as they ought to. We have the first 2 servants who took what they were given, these varying degrees of stewardship based upon their ability, and they were judged as being good and faithful because of what they did with it. They were not expected to have produced necessarily the exact same result, but they were judged according to what they had been given and what they had done with what they had been given. But then this third servant, the one who dug and put his talent in the ground, I want you to notice that he didn't really do anything wrong, not in a moral sense at least. The servant in the first illustration who was beating his fellow servants and eating and drinking with the drunkards, he was engaged in immoral activity. He was sinning, and he was doing things that he wasn't supposed to be doing. But this wicked and lazy servant in this third illustration was judged as being unworthy, not because he did wrong, but because he had failed to do right. He was judged as being unworthy because he had failed to make anything of what he had been given. And so from this illustration, we learn that readiness does not mean that we are simply found not doing anything wrong, that when Jesus arrives, that we are not actively engaged in sin, but rather that we are found having actively done what is right. That is the way that Jesus depicts readiness in this third illustration. Not just the absence of wrongdoing, but the active doing of that which is right. This brings us then to the final parable, and it's really not a parable at all. It's an illustration, but in this illustration we come to the most literal description of the final judgment yet. Jesus does not describe himself as a master. He does not describe himself as a bridegroom in this final section. Instead, he describes himself as the Son of Man. He does not say when the master comes or when the bridegroom arrives. He says when the Son of Man comes in his glory. And so that lets us know that we're moving into a more literal explanation of the final judgment. Now, that's not to say that there are not figurative elements in this section or that this is to be taken completely literal. But this is the closest we come to a description of the final judgment. At this point, Jesus drops much of the parabolic language that he had been using up until this point, and he describes the final judgment in a very straightforward way. I want you to notice this final contrast that is made, starting in verse 31. He says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me.' Then the righteous will answer him, saying, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me.' Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me.' Then they also will answer, saying, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger, or naked or sick or in prison, and did not minister to you?' Then he will answer them, saying, 'Truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me.' And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." So as I said, this is probably the most striking illustration that he gives us, in that he is describing the separation that will take place on the day of judgment in the most vivid way yet. He gives us this final contrast in which we have the sheep and the goats, and he separates the sheep and places them on his right side and the goats on his left. And this is the final contrast. This is the final distinction that is made throughout this section. Those on the right are said to be blessed, and they are warmly welcomed into the Lord's kingdom, whereas those on the left are said to be cursed, and they are coldly excluded from it. But what was the criteria that he judged them based upon? What was it that determined their eternal fate? Was it that God had simply foreordained that those on the right would be saved and those on the left would be condemned? Or was it that perhaps those on the right were favored over those on the left, as though God were a respecter of persons? We see here that God judges these people. The Lord distinguishes between these two groups based upon brotherly love. It is brotherly love, or the lack thereof, that determines their ultimate fate. He says in verse 40, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." But the opposite is also true. And so he says in verse 45 to those on his left, that as they failed to do it to those, he says as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. Jesus is revealing here the importance of brotherly love, and he is showing us that our fate will be determined based upon whether or not we have shown it or whether or not it is lacking in our lives. He is showing us that we ready ourselves for the Lord by rendering our love to his people. He has been showing us in each of these contrasts what preparation looks like. He has shown us that preparation in the first illustration means being found actively engaged in that which is right. He showed us in the second illustration that preparation means being prepared for his delay. He showed us in the third illustration that preparation means actively doing that which is right during the interim until he comes. And in this final illustration, he shows us that preparation means showing love to the brotherhood. Jesus said in John chapter 13, verse 35, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." And it is here that we see here in Matthew chapter 25, this final section, that Jesus will recognize those who belong to him based upon this same metric, based upon this same standard. He will recognize those on his right based upon the love that they have for one another. And so this is how we prepare ourselves for the Lord's return. This is how we prepare for the final judgment, is by showing brotherly love. This is going to conclude our study on Matthew chapters 24 through 25. I hope that you have been able to understand the ultimate message that is being conveyed throughout it. Although this is a difficult text, and although this is something that I think it's easy to lose yourself in, whenever you rightly divide the word of truth and you understand the Lord's words in their proper context and make proper application of them, then this is one of the most remarkable passages in the entire Bible. In the first section, we saw that the Lord's words concerning Jerusalem and the temple were fulfilled to the uttermost. They were fulfilled in their entirety. And in this section, Jesus has revealed to us concerning the final judgment that heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And so if the judgment against Jerusalem proved true, then the judgment of the world will prove true as well. And although there are going to be many who are not ready for it and many who do not anticipate it, and it will come upon us when we least expect it, it is coming, and the Lord will return. He will sit on his glorious throne, and he will make this final separation. So let us make sure that no matter when it occurs, we are ready for it. And if you are here this morning and you have not obeyed the gospel, then that is how you can ready yourself for this event this very morning. If you have not yet committed your life to Christ, then we want to offer you the opportunity to do so this morning. If you have yet to obey the gospel, we want to extend that opportunity to come forward confessing Jesus as the Christ, to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, to repent of those sins, and to walk faithfully from this day forward. Whatever your need is, we ask that you would come forward at this time.